Atheism is often presented as the default worldview. Its defenders will tell you they are simply following the evidence, rejecting myths and superstitions, and grounding their lives in reason and science. But when we look closely, something strange happens. The very arguments used to defend atheism rely on ideas like logic, morality, and truth that atheism itself cannot justify. In this video, we'll examine 5 of the most common atheist arguments. We'll see why they sound persuasive at first, but ultimately collapse under their own weight. And we'll discover that atheism, far from being a neutral starting point, actually borrows from the Christian worldview every time it opens its mouth to argue against God. One of the most common defenses of atheism is the claim that atheism isn't really a worldview at all. You've probably heard it. Atheism is just a lack of belief in God. That seems simple and safe. It frames atheism as neutral, as if the atheist isn't making any claims, just sitting back and waiting for evidence. But let's examine this carefully. At first glance, this tactic sounds reasonable. If someone claims there's a magical unicorn in their garage, the burden of proof is on them to prove it. If they can't, you simply withhold belief. By comparing God to a unicorn or fairy tale, atheists position themselves as skeptics, not participants in the debate. It sounds like they're saying, we don't have to prove anything, we simply don't believe until we're convinced. But this is an illusion. There is no neutral ground in worldview debates. The moment you make a statement about reality, even the statement, I just lack belief, you are presupposing certain things. You're assuming that logic is real and reliable, that truth exists and can be known, and that your reasoning faculties are trustworthy. These are positive claims. By even entering the conversation, the atheist has already committed to a worldview, whether they admit it or not. So here's the problem. Atheism has no way to justify these assumptions. Why should logic exist in a purely material universe of chance and chaos? Why should our minds, the product of blind evolution, be capable of discerning truth? Why should truth matter at all in a purposeless cosmos? When atheists say they lack just belief, they are smuggling in these assumptions for free, while denying the God who makes them possible. Imagine a judge in a courtroom saying, I don't take a side between guilty and not guilty, I just lack belief. But the very act of judging is taking a side. Likewise, atheists can't escape responsibility by claiming to lack belief. They are making a claim about reality, that there is no God, and they need to defend it. Neutrality is a myth. Everyone, including the atheist, stands on a foundation. The question is whether that foundation can actually support the weight of logic, truth, and morality, and atheism simply cannot. Another common line is the demand for evidence. Show me proof that God exists, they say, or there's no reason to believe. On the surface, this seems perfectly reasonable. After all, in science and everyday life, we rely on evidence to make decisions. But here's the problem. This objection assumes a very particular view of evidence, one that atheism itself cannot justify. Most atheists mean empirical evidence, things we can measure with our senses. But the claim only empirical evidence counts is not itself something that can be proven empirically. You can't put empiricism under a microscope. You can't measure it in a lab. It's a philosophical position, one that's taken entirely on faith. Worse, when atheists demand sensory proof of God, they're caught in a circle. They are using their senses and reasoning to prove that their senses and reasoning are reliable. Imagine a man accused of lying who says, I'm telling the truth because I just told you I never lie. That's the exact same problem here. Without God, there is no ultimate guarantee that our minds are reliable or that the universe is orderly and consistent. So when it comes to the preconditions of science, we have this situation where science itself depends on certain preconditions, that the universe is rational and governed by consistent laws, that our minds are capable of understanding it, that truth and logic exist independently of our opinions. Atheism can't account for any of these. It's like using a bridge while denying that bridges exist. So, when an atheist demands evidence for God, they are already borrowing from the Christian worldview, the very worldview that they're trying to disprove. They are like a person arguing against air while breathing it in with every word. The question is not whether there is evidence, but which worldview makes sense of the evidence. Without God, even the tools we use to evaluate proof, reason, senses, science, collapse into absurdity. Many atheists say morality is just personal preference or cultural convention. There are no objective moral truths, they argue. This view sounds humble and non-judgmental. It avoids hard conversations about good and evil by reducing them to taste and opinion, but this position has devastating consequences. Science can describe what is, it can tell us how humans behave, but it can never tell us what we ought to do. You can't get a moral duty from a description of atoms in motion. On atheism, morality reduces to evolutionary programming, behaviours that helped our ancestors survive. But survival doesn't equal goodness. After all, genocide could increase survival for a particular group. If morality is subjective, then concepts like justice and injustice are meaningless. The statement, murder is wrong, would simply mean, I don't personally prefer murder. But preferences have no binding force. That's why atheism ultimately leads to moral nihilism, the belief that nothing is truly right or wrong. Even debating itself assumes morality. When atheists argue, they expect honesty, fairness, and rational discourse. But those expectations only make sense if there are real objective moral duties. If everything is subjective, why should anyone care about truth or fairness in debate? Without God, every argument becomes just a contest of personal taste, like arguing over which flavour of ice cream is best. Our shared moral experience cries out against this. Deep down, we all know there are things that are truly evil. Murder, rape, torture of the innocent. These are not just personal dislikes, they are wrong in a way that transcends opinion. And that only makes sense if there is a real objective moral law, and a lawgiver behind it. Some atheists, especially those familiar with evolutionary theory, will say this: our reasoning abilities evolved to help us survive, not necessarily to know truth. At first, this sounds like an explanation for why humans make mistakes, but if taken seriously, it destroys the very possibility of rational thought. The philosopher Alvin Plantinga formulated what's called the evolutionary argument against naturalism. In simple terms, it goes like this: if naturalism and evolution are both true, then our minds were shaped by blind forces for survival, not for truth. Beliefs are useful if they help you survive, even if they're false. Therefore, we have no reason to trust that any of our beliefs, including atheism, are actually true. This creates a fatal loop. The atheist is saying, my brain is the product of blind, purposeless processes, but trust me, it's giving me reliable knowledge about reality. That's like trusting a magic 8-ball to solve calculus problems. If your beliefs are just survival mechanisms, you have no rational grounds for believing they're accurate. Only theism solves this problem. If our minds were designed by a rational creator, then we have a reason to believe they are generally aimed at truth. Without God, reason collapses into chaos, and every argument, including atheism itself, becomes suspect. This is perhaps the most emotionally powerful argument. If God is all good and all powerful, they ask, why is there so much evil and suffering in the world? It's a fair question, one that Christians have wrestled with for centuries. But atheism doesn't solve the problem. In fact, it makes it far worse. To even call something evil assumes there's a real objective standard of goodness. You can't label something crooked unless you know what straight is. On atheism, there is no ultimate standard. Good and evil are just different configurations of atoms, meaningless labels we project onto a purposeless universe. So, when atheists point to evil, they are actually borrowing from the Christian worldview to make their case. They need God in order to define evil, even as they try to use evil to disprove him. Christianity offers a deeper explanation. Evil exists not because God is absent, but because creatures with free will have chosen to rebel against him. The very pain and brokenness of this world points to a reality beyond it, a reality where justice and healing will ultimately be restored. Atheism often claims to be neutral, rational, and evidence-based. But as we've seen, its most common arguments collapse under examination. They rely on ideas like logic, morality, truth, and meaning, all of which only make sense if God exists. In the end, even the attempt to argue against God proves his reality. The question is not whether there's evidence for God, but whether any other worldview can make sense of the evidence we already have.